Good morning. It's good to see all of you this morning. I didn't really yell at the TV last night. I restrained myself. So my voice should be okay today. There were kids playing in the backyard of the house behind us, and I didn't want them to hear me yelling at the TV, so I kept myself restrained. It was a Ohio State game, so maybe not the same yelling you all were doing, maybe for your teams, but it's good to see you all here this morning. We're in the book of Exodus. We've been studying through the book of Exodus, and we are in Exodus chapter 20. The children of Israel have left Egypt. They have traveled across the wilderness, and they have made their way to Mount Sinai, which God had foretold Moses that when you bring the people out, you're going to come and worship me on this mountain. And so he had told them that they were going to come to this particular area in order to worship him. And so they prepared themselves for 3 days. We noticed that last week in Exodus chapter 19, that they made preparations for themselves, that they came near to the mountain. And I just kind of want to point this out again because folks have a misunderstanding, I think, about this. But Moses kind of goes back and forth between the Lord on the mountain and down to the people. And he goes up on the mountain, and God says, you need to go back down. You need to tell the people not to break through, not to touch the mountain, not to come near, not to have the priests come near, even lest they die, right? Lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses says, well, we've already done that. We've already set guards. I already told them not to do that. And God says, go down there and tell them again anyways. And if you look at the end of chapter 19, in verse 23, Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against you. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And so at the very end of chapter 19, Moses has come down from the mountain, and he has spoken to the people. And that's where he is when God speaks the Ten Commandments here in Exodus chapter 20, that the people are going to see the thunderings and the lightnings. They're going to witness all of that, but they're also going to hear the voice of the Lord. It says, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He's always going to remind them of what it is that he's done for them. When we talk about the aspects of the covenant that God is going to establish here with the children of Israel, that he always reminds them of what it is that he's done for them. He's the one who has led them out of Egypt. And you'll see that even when you read in the prophets, that he constantly is reminding them of all the things that he's done for them. And so he says, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. And so you shall have no other gods before me. We talked about that he's the only God, right? That he needs to be the only one. We covered that last week. You shall have no other gods before me, right? Not to make any carved image or molten image, that they're not to have any idols. Now, here's why I'm kind of emphasizing that, because when we get over to chapter 32 and they make a golden calf, sometimes we tend to think, well, they don't, Moses hasn't brought the law down to them yet. They don't know that they're not supposed to make any representations of Yahweh, right? They don't know that they're not supposed to make any idols. Yeah, they do, because God is speaking this in their hearing. They're hearing this, and so they're well aware that they're not supposed to make any idols when they go ahead and ask Aaron to make for them a god, right? So they're not to have any images. And we talked about how those images, they wouldn't be able to represent God accurately, right? That there'd be something imperfect in that idol, and even if you wanted that idol to be a representation of the true God. Or if you made it after animals or human beings, right? If you fashioned it after them, well, animals and human beings have imperfections in them. They're not going to be adequate. We talked about how idols tended to lead to materialism, and in Judges, you got a man who has an idol, and then people come into his house and they break in and they steal it, and it led to materialism, right? It makes people think that God is local, that he's limited, that, you made the idol, well, couldn't you destroy the idol? The idol can't speak to you. It doesn't eat anything. It doesn't do anything. If it wants to go someplace, you have to pick it up and carry it. It's senseless, right? The idea of idolatry. And from our perspective, we don't see people, maybe carving things and bowing down to them in our age. Maybe that happens more, in Eastern nations over in Asia, that they still do some of those things. But you don't really see that taking place in the Western world by and large. But do we have idols? Yeah. What are some things that we have as idols? Money. Cell phones? Yeah. I mean, can you set it down for 5 minutes? It's really funny. I go to the bank, and it doesn't matter which branch of the bank I go to. There's one branch that's in Sevierville and one that's here in Pigeon Forge. But whichever branch of the bank I go to, there's always 7 or 8 people that are ahead of me. And it doesn't matter what time of day or what day of the week. Maybe it's because I'm always going during the first of the month, right? Maybe that's why there's a lot of people there. But I'm standing in line, and I start watching folks that are in line in front of me, and then as I get closer, I look at the folks that are standing in line behind me, and I'm the only person that's not on my cell phone. They're watching videos while they're standing in line at the bank. I'm like, you can't put that thing away for 5 minutes, just to kind of think about what your business is here at the bank, or maybe, have some deeper thoughts than, watching some guy crash on a surfboard or whatever. I don't know what they're watching. But yeah, we get addicted to those things, right? And anything we place ahead of God, anything that we give more importance to God. How many times have you turned around and gone back to your house because you forgot your cell phone? How many times have you turned around and gone back to your house because you forgot your Bible? Right? Now, sometimes sometimes your phone is the same, right? Your Bible's on your phone maybe today because of all the apps and stuff that we have. But that's, but you understand what I'm saying. Which do we give more importance to, right? Sometimes it's those devices. Money can be a great idol, right? That we chase after money. Maybe we work overtime when we don't have to, and we miss the Lord's services, right? What are we putting ahead of God in that instance? Do we put sports sometimes ahead of God? Right? I like watching Ohio State, but if that game had gone into overtime or something, I need to get rest for what I'm about to do today, right? There have been times where I haven't watched the end of the game. I didn't even know they beat Notre Dame until the day after, right? Because they were losing. There was 4 minutes left in the game. I shut it off. And I went to bed because I knew if they lost, I was going to be angry. I knew if they won, I wasn't going to be able to get to sleep, right? And so I shut it off and I went to bed and I figured I'll see the rest tomorrow, right? And so sometimes maybe we have to, set our priorities in the way that they should be. But if we put things ahead of God, right? God's got to be first, and that's what he's getting after here, right? I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. I'm the only God, right? Don't put anything else ahead of me, whether it's an idol, another God, or some sort of materialism that you might have. That brings us to the third commandment here in verse 7. He says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." I think there's some misunderstanding maybe with regards to this commandment as well, with regards to taking God's. When we see that you shall not take God's name in vain, we think typically of one thing. That's using God's name as a swear word, right? And people certainly do that. And it's funny, movies will filter things, or TV stations will filter things out of movies with regards to language, right? They'll blank out, but they'll always leave blasphemy in there for some reason, right? They'll leave that using God's name as a swear word in there, but they're taking other swear words, or they're muting the other swear words out. It doesn't make any sense to me that that's the one that you would leave in there, right? When you're taking those things out of TV programs. But this idea of taking it in vain is not just using it as a swear word. Vain here means worthless or useless. Making God's name something that is worthless or useless. Now, do we use God's name in church when we're singing to him, when we're singing hymns to him? Is it all right for us to sing, God bless the USA, right? Because I think so. But there are ways that we can make God's name worthless that are more than just using it as a swear word. Somebody gets surprised by something and they say, Oma. What is that? That's using God's name in a way that's useless and senseless and not worthwhile. And you read articles about teenagers that use that phrase over and over and over again, and they'll say, well, we don't mean anything by it. It's just something we say. We don't mean anything by it. That's the problem, right? That's the issue. That's the taking it in vain. Now, whether you just use the 3 initials, right, or whether you say the whole thing out, couldn't we say something else besides taking the Lord's name in vain? Now, the Jews, their understanding of this, not taking the Lord's name in vain, not making it common or doing it in a way that is useless, they decided that rather than every place that Yahweh showed up in the Old Testament, that they changed that to Adonai, right? And they changed, so it would be, so when you read your Bibles, it's the Lord said, right? And it's usually capital letters, but that's because they didn't want to use the name Yahweh because they thought, well, that's going to make it come. Well, I think when we're talking about religious things, when we're reading about what the Lord has done for us, I don't think that's taking the Lord's name in vain. It's not taking it in a way that's useless or unprofitable, but it's a way of us being able to see, here's all the things that God has done for us. Does that make sense? Comments or questions on these things?
So going back to coming out of Egypt, how many times over and over do you read that they always wanted to go back to Egypt?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that this morning in the worship hour. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think too, it's also the empty swearing. Like I swear to, when people say that to emphasize that something really happened, they swear to God based on that. That this is also kind of that vein, using His name in vain that we need to be careful of, or at least people we associate with.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an idea here of false oaths, right? That they would, if you swore by the temple, you didn't have to keep that oath, right? But if you swore by the gold that's in the temple, well, that you have to keep, right? It's kind of like having your fingers crossed behind your back or something like that when you made your promise, that it doesn't count, right? Well, he wants them to keep their oaths. If they made oaths, he wants them to keep those. And if they've sworn to do something by the Lord and invoked his name in that oath, then they're bound to keep that, right? That they're not to take it in vain and have their fingers crossed or something like that. Well, it doesn't count, kind of deal. In Psalm 111 and verse 9 in the King James translation, it says, holy and reverend is God's name, right? His name is to be holy, is to be reverend. We need to treat his name with respect. And so it's not something that we should use as a curse word. It's not something that we should use when we're excited or when we're surprised by something. We need to be careful that we're giving God the honor, right, that he deserves. In verse 8, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, nor you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Here he's given the command for the Sabbath day, for the Sabbath day requirement, that they are to rest on the Sabbath day, that they are not to do work on the Sabbath day. Now, we already kind of saw that they had some regulations with regards to the seventh day and the picking up of the manna, right? That 6 days they were to gather the manna, but the seventh day they weren't to gather the manna, right? They were to pick up a double portion on the sixth day to carry them over for the seventh day, that they weren't to go out and pick up manna. It wasn't going to be there, right? God's testing them to see if they're going to be faithful to him. But this meant a day of rest. Now, not doing any work, not letting your children do any work, not letting your servants do any work. It was basically, you're not to do any work of commerce, right? Like if you're a carpenter, you're not doing any of your carpentry work that you're going to get paid for on the Sabbath day. You're resting from your labors. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't do anything. And see, that's the misunderstanding that some of the Jews had with regards to the Sabbath day. The law had some Sabbath day requirements, but then the Pharisees said, well, if we're not to do this, let's get as far away from doing any, and so they enacted a whole bunch of extra traditions that they had, that you can't do this on the Sabbath and you can't do that on the Sabbath. And so Jesus comes along and he starts challenging their traditions with regards to this. And when they tell him that he's violated something, what do they say that he's violated? You have violated the traditions of the elders, right? They don't say you violated God's law, right? You violated the traditions of the elders, because the things that he was doing was kind of challenging them. And he says, well, if you had a donkey and he fell in a hole, would you not pull him out of there on the Sabbath day? Is it wrong to do something good on the Sabbath day when Jesus would heal folks? I think sometimes he did it on purpose on the Sabbath day, right? In order to try to get them to understand, you've added all these things on. This wasn't God's intention for this. They accused him and his disciples of breaking the Sabbath law when they went through the grain fields, right? And they were, well, is it okay to eat on the Sabbath day? Is it okay to cook what you need on the Sabbath day? I think with what's going on now over in Israel, they're giving them some special, the people that are in the army, they're saying, well, you don't have to keep the Sabbath requirements because you're defending the nation, right? And so they're obviously working on Saturdays now with regards to what they're doing in the war over there. Sometimes there are things that have to be done, right? And it's not wrong to do the things that have to be done. on that. Now the Sabbath day is Saturday. It's the seventh day of the week. Right? So there are some folks that say, well, the Sabbath day switched from Saturday to Sunday when the Christian age came to be. That's not the case. The Sabbath day was the seventh day of the week, right? On the seventh day you shall rest. When is it the Christians come together? The first day of the week, right? The first day and the seventh day, unless my math is wrong, they're not the same, right? Those are two different days. And while we're at it, why are there 7 days in a week? It goes back to the creation, right? Every society's got a 7-day week, right? Every civilized society. Well, where did the 7-day week come from? We understand the year, 365 days, right? Because that's how long it takes us to circle the sun once, right? We understand 24 hours in a day, right? Because that's how long it takes the earth to do one complete rotation. But there's nothing scientifically for a 7-day week except for here. And it's not 7,000 years. It's not 7 millennia. There's not a great big gap between day one and day two. Because if there was, then what God tells Moses here, what God tells the people here of Israel, that why are you going to hallow the seventh day? Why are you going to respect the seventh day? Because God created the world in 6 days. Now, if it was 6,000 years, then when you get to Sabbath day, I'm looking forward to that because you get to rest for 1,000 years, man, right? No, the whole thing would break down. The whole argument would break down as far as the reason why you are to rest on the seventh day is because God rested on the seventh day after creating everything in 6 literal days. And so it says God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it for them. And so they are to remember that day. They are to keep that throughout their generations, that they are to remember the Sabbath day. Verse 12 of Exodus 20. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. They are to honor their parents. They were supposed to take care, children are supposed to take care of their parents. I wish my daughter were here this morning. We helped her get moved into her new place yesterday. We were helping take care of her, which we do. You take care of your children, right? And then your children, in turn, are supposed to help take care of you when the time comes. But to honor your father and mother, right? We're more than just obedience to them, right? That you're honoring them. That idea of honor a lot of times has to do with financial things, right? Honor the widows who are widows indeed, it says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, right? That honor means to take care of some of their physical, some of their financial needs, right? The elders who are worthy of double honor, right? Those who rule well are worthy of double honor. Well, what is that? Well, you respect them, right? You obey them, those that rule over you, but it also means that maybe elders, if necessary, could be paid from the church treasury, that you honor them, right? And so that honor has to do with taking care of them. This is repeated over in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 2, right? That you honor your mother and father, for this is the first commandment with promise, right? Now, there's not been a promise with the other ones, right? You just do this, right? You have no other gods. You don't make any idols. You don't take the Lord's name in vain. You remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is the first commandment with promise, right? Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land. Now, there's 2 ideas with regards to what he's talking about here when he says your days will be long upon the land. Does that mean if we take care of our parents, we're going to live a long time physically on the earth? It could, right? But have you known people that have taken care of their parents that didn't live physically a long time on the earth? Did God not keep his promise in that particular instance? The idea of them keeping this commandment so that your days may be prolonged may have to do with them being able to remain in the land that they're about to go into. Right? The land of Canaan that they're going to inherit, the land that God is going to give them. If you keep, and it's just kind of a generic thing, right? If you keep God's commandments, were they going to be able to stay in that land for a long time, right? God had given them that land forever, right? That was his intention, to give them that land forever if they keep his commandments. What if they don't? They went into captivity, right? Now, other nations that didn't do what God wanted, God wiped them out, right? God got rid of them. He doesn't do that with Israel. Do you know why he doesn't wipe Israel out completely? Yeah, he's Jesus, right? Because the seed line, right? God had made a promise that in the seed of Abraham, all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed. So it's through the nation of Israel that the Messiah is coming, that Jesus is coming. And because he's made that promise, he can't wipe them out because he wouldn't then be able to keep the other promise that he made, right? So rather than wiping them out, he takes them out behind the woodshed for 70 years. And they go off into Babylonian captivity, right? Because they wouldn't keep the commandments of the Lord. And so being in the land a long time is conditional. It's conditional upon them doing what it is that they were supposed to do. Now, God gave them the land. They didn't do what God wanted them to do, and God had them removed from the land. They went off into captivity. Now, a remnant of them got to come back after the Babylonian captivity. And so succeeding generations would be able to stay in the land for a long time. They'd be able to possess that land for a long time if they keep God's commandments. Verse 13, you shall not murder. This is commandment number 6, you shall not murder. There are different words that are used in Hebrew with regards to killing. There's a word that's like the death penalty, right? If somebody does this, then you take them out and you stone them, right? Or you cut them off from Israel, right? That they are to die. And so there's one word that's the penalty for what this word is here when he says you shall not murder. This you shall not murder is the idea of something that is premeditated, right? That you've done on purpose, that you've killed somebody on purpose, that you intended to kill them. And even within our law today, we've got differences, right? There's first-degree murder that you planned out and you thought out in advance. You knew exactly what you were going to do, right? And you did it on purpose. And then we have manslaughter, right? Well, that's an accident. You didn't intend to do that. You were maybe careless or reckless and something happened and somebody died. And so we've got differences within our law as well with regards to these things. And we see that that's here in this as well. And so the idea here with thou shalt not murder is something that's violent, something that's premeditated. And when somebody takes a life, do you know what the penalty was in the Old Testament if you killed somebody? It was death, right? Now, people will use this commandment to say we shouldn't have a death penalty. Right, that it's wrong to kill, and so you're trying to say, well, they were guilty of murder, and so you're going to convict them of being guilty of murder, and then the response is that you're going to murder them yourself. No, there's different words that are used with regards to the death penalty. God's okay with the death penalty. You see it over and over again in the Old Testament. If you struck your parents, it was worthy of the death penalty. If you committed adultery, right? It was worthy of the death penalty. There was a man that went out and picked up sticks on the Sabbath day. Right? Maybe that was his business. Maybe he was in the firewood business or something. He's out picking up kindling wood, right? And they asked what should be done, and they said stone him with stones. Right? God's okay with the death penalty, and so there's a difference between something that's premeditated and something that's a penalty for what it is that they've done. God allows governments to wield the sword, right? That we are to respect governing authorities because God has given them the ability to wield the sword in those cases. Comments or questions on these things?
Paul talks about that in Romans. Be for the government, if you do right, don't fear the government. If you do wrong, fear for it. It's God's has been governments in place, and God was allowed, was one who gave them the authority to do this, to have the death penalty. So Paul addresses that in Romans.
Yeah, yep. So we get that in the New Testament as well, right? That it's there. And so, is killing wrong? Is murder wrong? Yes, it is, right? And murder's wrong in just about every civilized society that you have, right? That seems to be something that God's implanted into us, that moral idea, right? That people have, even people that aren't Christians, even people that don't adhere to what the Bible says, right? They've got penalties for murder in their countries. Why is that? Because there's a moral law, right, that's there, and there's a moral lawgiver that has to come from. We can't just determine amongst ourselves what's right or what's wrong because we all have different opinions on that, right? Hitler had a different opinion on what he thought was right and what was wrong, but his opinion wasn't right, right? It wasn't in accordance with what God's word has to say. And so we need to be careful about trying to use "you shall not murder" as an anthem against the death penalty because the words are different, and God was okay with the death penalty. Next it says, you shall not commit adultery. That should be pretty straightforward, right? Adultery is having sexual relations with somebody who's married to somebody else, right? Maybe you're married to somebody else, maybe they're married to somebody else, maybe you're both married to somebody else. Adultery, you shall not commit adultery. It's one man, one woman, right? For life is the idea. If your spouse dies, you're free according to Romans chapter 7 to be able to marry somebody else. The only exception to that is in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9. If your spouse commits adultery, you can put them away and you can be married again, right? But you are not to commit adultery. If you marry again and you don't have a scriptural right to have a second marriage, Jesus says that you're committing adultery in Matthew chapter 19. And so here, you shall not commit adultery. They weren't to do that. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Now, there's some acts of stealing that are blatant. There's some acts of stealing that it's a no-brainer, right? If I go into the store and I'm shopping and I find some things and I put something over here and I put something over there and I go through the checkout and I don't pay for that, well, that's blatant, right? That's stealing. If I go in and I smash the store up and I grab all the stuff and come running out with what I've smashed and grabbed, right? That's obvious. That's stealing. Some of it's a little more subtle. Software has a copyright on it. And when you buy software now with Microsoft, if you get like the subscription to Microsoft, you might be able to put that on 3 or 4 different devices, right? You might be able to buy like a family plan. And you get licenses to be able to put that on different devices. But if you've got one license for the software, right? Jacob says, "Man, I'd really like to have, the picture altering, software." And I've got that. And I said, "Well, here, you can borrow mine," and he can load that on his computer, and then he can use Photoshop. That's what it is. He can use Photoshop, right? And no, there's a license for that. And sometimes we don't think about that with regards to stealing. I know that my neighbor's cable is active and it's up there on that pole, and I can go up there and I can put a splitter on that pole and I can run a wire into my house and I can have cable in my house that my neighbor's paying for, right? It's stealing, right? You who teach thou shalt not steal, do you steal, right? Paul says over in Romans again. Thou shalt not steal. It covers a lot of different stuff. Plagiarism. Right? You got to write a paper for school, and it's the 11th hour, and you don't have time to finish it, and so you get AI maybe to now. I didn't have AI when I was growing up. I couldn't ask the computer to write the paper for me, right? But people are using AI now to write their school papers. That's going to be difficult to police, I think. As a former educator, I don't know how you would police that if AI wrote it. But there's different things out there that you can find out that people have plagiarized, right? They've gone someplace else and they've taken somebody else's work and they've put their name on it. I've heard of preachers, unfortunately, doing those types of things, that they'll take a bulletin article that's not theirs and then they'll slap their name on it. I knew of a case where a guy was doing that. He was taking somebody else's bulletin articles and he was putting them in the bulletin and he was slapping his name on it. And then he called the preacher that had written the articles and said, "Hey, would it be okay if I used your bulletin, your articles that you wrote and put them in our bulletin?" And he says, "Well, sure, you can do that." And he says, "Well, is it okay if I put them in there, but I put my name on there instead of yours?" And the preacher said, "Well, why would you want to do that?" Well, come to find out that the congregation that he had been employed at had fired him for plagiarism, and he was trying to go back after the fact and get permission to do what it was that he did, to go back and tell his elders, well, it's okay because he said I could do it. You need to stand on your own 2 legs. You need to do your own work. You can't steal somebody else's work and slap their name on it. Now, there may be times where you've heard something, right, or you've heard a story, you've heard an illustration, and you don't remember where you got it from, right? Because you've heard it over and over again. Maybe you've heard it from a lot of different preachers over the years. And in those types of things, I had an instructor one time that said originality is just forgetting where you got it from, right? Everything we know we've gotten from somewhere, right? We've read somebody's writing, we've heard somebody preach it, we've heard somebody speak it or say it, and but we need to be doing our own work. We need to not be stealing other people's work, and that's part of this too. Failure to pay our loans back. Well, that can be stealing, because if I take a loan and I know full well I'm never going to pay this loan back, I'm just going to buy this even though I can't afford it, and I'm going to take the loan out and I'm going to make a couple of payments, then I'm going to quit paying on it, then I'm going to file for bankruptcy and I'll get to keep whatever it is that I bought, right? If you're going into it with that mentality, well, that's stealing. We need to be people that are going to repay our loans, right? That we're going to be people of our word, with regards to that. We said we would pay it back when we borrowed it. When we use that credit card, we're making an agreement. We're saying we agree that we're going to pay this, right? When you sign your name, that's what you're signing for, that you've agreed that you're going to pay this back. Verse number 16 here of Exodus 20. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, right? This is lying, right? You say you shall not lie, right? You need to be people that tell the truth. Now, not lying doesn't mean you tell everybody about every 100% of all your business, right? But you need to be truthful in what it is you say. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? And not to bear false witness. Giving a false impression, right? Does your neighbor over here, is he an alcoholic? Well, I'm not really sure about that. Maybe giving a false impression, right, about somebody. And so not to bear false witness. Gossip sometimes can be that way. Some gossip is maybe true, right? What's said is true, but it doesn't need to be said. And then there's malicious gossip, which is stuff that you make up because you want to drag that person down to make yourself feel bigger. And that could be bearing false witness. Right? Convicting somebody with insufficient evidence. Now, it amazes me that they'll have somebody on videotape, shooting people, and then they'll say, well, he's the suspect. He allegedly shot these folks. Well, they got it on video, right? There's not a whole lot of mystery behind that. But sometimes they catch somebody and say, well, he's a person of interest, and they'll immediately, he's guilty in the public court of opinion before any of the evidence has ever been heard, right? And so convicting with insufficient evidence, what did they do to Jesus?
Every trial was false.
Yeah, the charges were false, right? They were looking, they couldn't find false witnesses. They had to do a search to find people that would be willing to bear false witness against Jesus, right? Now, they're okay with breaking this commandment, right? Bearing false witness in order to convict Jesus. But those same Jews didn't want to take the money back that they had given to Judas for selling him out because it was blood money, and they didn't want to put the blood money in the treasury. Well, that's hypocritical, right? But we aren't to bear false witness against our neighbor. Verse number 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. This do not covet, right? You shall not covet is the 10th and final commandment that's here of these 10. This is the one that leads into a whole bunch of the other ones, right? If I covet my neighbor's wife, what other commandment might I break? Adultery, right? If I covet my neighbor's ox, right, or his vehicle, right, or something that he has in his house, what other commandment might I break? You shall not steal, right? And so this kind of gets at the heart of a whole bunch of the other commandments, right? Because if you covet something, what besides selfishness is behind every sin that we commit? Envy and jealousy, but is it not selfishness on our part, right? That we are that way because we want the attention, right? I'm more important than somebody else, right? And so we get envious or we get jealous because they're getting something that I didn't get, right? But selfishness, right? Well, covetousness is a form of selfishness, right? That I want what I want and I want it when I want it, right? And it doesn't matter what I got to do to get it. It doesn't matter who I have to hurt to get it. Covetousness can be a big problem for us in the United States.
That's the flesh, lust, desires, and pride of life.
Yeah, yeah.
Covetousness comes from lust. You want it, so I'm going to do what I need to get it. And I want it because that's just going to make me feel good. So there's the lust, there's the pride.
Now, it used to be what would keep people from, if I want something, just doing anything to go get it. What keeps us from doing that as human beings? What restricts us from just, like if I'm stronger than my neighbor and I want his big screen TV, what stops me from going into his house, beating him up and taking his TV? Conscience, right? But why am I worried about that? The law? Well, the police may come after me, but if it's less than $1,000, they may just let me walk out anyways, right? Morality. Where does morality come from? God's standards, right? There's a higher authority, Right? Yeah, I might have to answer to the courts, I may have to answer to the legal system, but there's a higher authority that I'm going to have to answer to, that if I break these laws, right? If I do what it is that I want, if I just live my life any way that I please, no matter who it's going to hurt or no matter what laws I'm going to break. The thing that restricts me is that I know that there's a higher authority, and I know that there's a punishment that's going to have to be made for that, right? There's an eternity in hell to pay if we decide that we're going to live our lives that way. What happens when you take that away from society? What happens when you get rid of that higher authority, when you take it out of the school system, when you tell people that they just evolved from apes and monkeys? Anything goes. Is that what we're seeing? Why? What's the solution to school shootings? What's the solution to the crime that we see in our country? What's the solution to all of these things? We got to put God back in our society. Right? We've told God, take your nose out of our business, get out of our society, we don't want you here, right? Taking them out of the schools, and we've ruined a whole generation at least of children. And you see the way that they're behaving, you see the way that people behave, the way that people act. It's because they don't have a higher power to answer to. And when you don't have that, right, very hard to have freedom. Very hard to have freedom when you don't have people that are self-policing, because the police can't be everywhere.
That's one of the things that atheists kind of answers, where did this innate morality come from? It didn't evolve, because we're not smart enough.
Right.
It came from God, because there is that innate, even if we take all these laws away, there's still within us an innate morality that we know certain things are right and certain things are wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I know we've expounded on several of the commandments, but I don't feel like we expounded enough on the do not kill and the commit adultery. Because in Matthew 5, when Jesus said, you know, if you're angry at your brother without a cause, you're in danger of killing and murder and in
Yeah.
danger of hellfire. Also, for the adultery, he said, I say that if you look upon a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery.
Yeah.
So there's a higher standard that the Lord wants us to be at, and I thought we needed to expound on those things.
Yeah, thank you. Those are good points. Yeah, it's taken me forever to get through Exodus. And so some things I'm trying to streamline a little bit more, but you're right. Jesus talks about both of those things on the Sermon on the Mount, right? And what Jesus is really getting at there is the heart, right? You don't just wake up one day and decide you're going to murder somebody, right? That's got a process, right, that you go through. That starts in the heart, right, and not having proper thoughts about other people. And so Jesus is getting at the heart of the matter with regards to our righteousness in that Sermon on the Mount, that you just don't, it's not just committing the act. You got to, like Barney Fife would do, right? You got to nip it in the bud, right? You got to get after that where it starts, right? And you got to have your heart in the right place. You have to have your mind in the right place, that you're not thinking wrong about your brother, that you're going to then commit murder, or you're not thinking wrong about one of your sisters, right, or women, and looking at them in that way, because that's going to lead you to something else, right? Denise?
For Joseph, he had made a covenant with his eyes not to even look upon a man. It starts with you and it spreads outward. I can't treat everybody the way God expects me to treat everybody if I don't wake up each and every day purposing in my heart that I'm going to do right by the people that I come in contact with.
Yeah.
But mainly because I know that I want to do right by God. And if my standard is I'm going to do right by God no matter what, then I'm automatically going to do what's right by everybody else.
Yeah, yeah. And when you look at these commandments, right, and it's interesting what Denise said there about doing right with God and doing right with each other. The first 4 commandments address our relationship with God, right? No other gods, no idols, don't take his name in vain, respect the day that he's made holy, right? Has to do with us and God, right? The fences against God. And then the last 6 are our relationship with each other, right? Offenses against mankind that we might have. And these 10 are going to be the basis for all the laws of Israel, right? They're all going to be based on, this is kind of the foundation of the Mosaic Law, these 10 that are here. They were all added because of transgression, right? That's what Paul says in Galatians chapter 3 and verses 18 and 19, right? Why the old law? Well, the law was added because of transgression. Yes, Mark?
Yeah, on that comment, I think about in Genesis, every one of these is shown to be the reason why we have these. Because of Genesis, the forefathers of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and sons, they all committed those things. Now Joseph stands out because he wanted something more. He learned through suffering, but they all and others committed
Well,
more of these heinous acts.
yeah, you see Cain commits murder, right? And Lamech in his lineage commits murder. You see polygamy that's there, and so there's adultery that's taken place. And so yeah, you see a lot of this, right? And things that have already been done, that people have already done, or how the Egyptians have treated, right, the nation of Israel, their children of Israel. And so you see a lot of that. So added because of transgression. The law, right, was going to bring a knowledge of sin and its penalty. And we're going to see that as we go on, that he's going to talk about different things, and here's the penalty for these different things. If this happens, then here's how you treat it, right? Here's how you deal with it as we go into chapter 21 and further. There are 613 total commandments in the Mosaic Law, right? It's not just, people talk about, well, you got to keep the Mosaic Law, you got to keep the 10 Commandments. Well, you're off by 603, because there's 613 total commandments in the Mosaic Law. 365 of those are prohibitions, right? Thou shalt not. 365. Maybe one for every day of the year, right? You can put that on the calendar, right? And every day we can read another thou shalt not from the Old Testament. 365 of those are prohibitions. 248 of those are positive commands. Thou shalt. This is what you need to be doing, right? This is what you shall do. Now again, these were things that were spoken to the children of Israel, right? God told Moses, you speak these things to the children of Israel. This Mosaic law was intended for the children of Israel, to separate them out from the Gentiles, to separate them out from the rest of the people that are around them. These were not meant necessarily for Gentiles. And so when people today say, well, we still need to keep the Mosaic law. Well, first off, it wasn't for us, it was for the Jews. But secondly, Jesus fulfilled the law, right? He nailed it to the cross. We obey the law of Christ. Now, out of these 10, you can find the basis of 9 of them in the New Testament. The Sabbath day is the one that you don't find repeated in the New Testament as far as what it is that we should do. Now, there are groups that still want to run around and respect the Sabbath day, or they don't want to work on the Sabbath day, or they want to say that Sunday is our Sabbath day. But that's not the case, right? It's not the case. Now, notice in verse 18, as I mentioned earlier, that this was something that all the people heard. Notice what it says here. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood far off. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us and we will hear, but let not God speak with us lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, that you may not sin. So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. The people heard all of this. Right? Moses had come down from the mountain. God spoke all of this in the hearing of the children of Israel, and it frightened them. It frightened them to the point that they thought that if they heard God speak to them anymore, that they were going to die. That they want Moses to be the intermediary. That they want Moses, you go talk to God, and you come back and tell us what it is that God has said. And Moses says, well, God has done this. God has told you these things in order that you would be afraid so that you won't sin. Right? God scared them on purpose because he wanted to keep them from sinning. He wanted to give them an incentive, if you will, or a deterrent to not sin. Notice in verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. Now in English, when we read that you, is he just saying that, did he just talk to Moses, or did he talk to all of them? We have a hard time identifying singular and plural in English when we see the word you, because it could be either or. Hebrew's more specific. This is a second person plural, you, right? So if y'all is singular, this would be all y'all, right? All y'all heard when I spoke to you, right? So God here is telling Moses, they all heard this. So they're without excuse later on when they decide that they're going to build an idol when we get over to chapter 32. Any last minute comments, questions, or snide remarks? Thank you for your attention and participation.